Hello again, this is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and on behalf of IPAA, welcome to another of our episodes of the Environmental Video Library that we're so happy to host. We have a fantastic speaker today that I think will really add a lot of value in figuring out about non-attainment and how it affects the U.S., but specifically with the Permian. As you know, I'm not the best interviewer, smartest one around, haha. But I've had a lot of great speakers in the past, but this one I think really is top of the line. Has just fantastic credentials. Could almost intimidate me if I'm not careful here. So, Anne Idsal Austin has a vast background on air, on environmental, regulatory, private practice. And so she comes with this with a fantastic experience level. She had been principal deputy administrator for the EPA up in DC, focused on clean air policy, Clean Air Act. So very pertinent to this. Then she was Region 6 administrator. So basically was one of the main administrators for the EPA, focused on New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and other areas. Then, since left there, did work with a law firm, and now is doing her own business, own office, focused on the legal side and the policy side of environmental, of air, primarily focused on oil and gas, but a little of other things as well. So fantastic experience to talk about non-attainment. Welcome, Anne. Really glad you're here to help us kind of work through all of this. Given that you are, and I'm saying this, much smarter than me, which the people that know me that are listening to it said that's not really a high bar, but that's okay. That we're going to start with a kind of a base level, kind of the foundation of this, which is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NAAQS, and kind of how that builds upon everything, or you build upon that to end up getting to the non-attainment and all the policies and changes associated with non-attainment. So with that, what is NAAQS? How's that get developed? How's it go from there?
Sure. Well, and first of all, Grant, thank you so much for having me on. It is a pleasure to visit with you today. And please, your reputation precedes you, and you need to give yourself a lot more credit. But it is a pleasure to be here today. Let's get right into it. So the NAAQS, just as you said, are a kind of a federal foundation which is intended to level the playing field and see that Americans, no matter where they live, enjoy very safe, healthy air to breathe. Now, the NAAQS were first established when the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. So you're looking at something that's, 50 some odd years old at this point, 53 years old to be specific. And the initial point and goal was to protect public health and the welfare from air pollution. Pretty basic, straightforward. Now, the standards initially established limits for 6 pollutants. Those are particulate matter, PM, ground level ozone, O3, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides, which are kind of colloquially known as NOx, sulfur dioxide, SO2, and lead. So those are the 6 criteria pollutants that the NAAQS set standards for. So what goes into setting the NAAQS is a really significant process, and it's laid out in the Clean Air Act. So under the Clean Air Act, every 5 years, the EPA is intended to go through a very robust assessment, which is supposed to be assisted by independent scientific advisory panels to ensure that health-based standards are promulgated by the EPA, but that those standards are informed by the latest science that's available. One very important thing to note that when it comes to setting the NAAQS, the EPA is prohibited from considering costs when setting or revising the NAAQS under the Clean Air Act. Again, because the focus there is supposed to be a health-based standard. It's not supposed to take into consideration, cost to regulate, cost to implement, the subsequent changes that might come with those changing standards. It is just a health and science-based approach.
So when you do that, this is kind of a interesting point. So if it's not cost based, it's kind of a perfect world situation. But the reality is, your decisions on these standards will have a cost. So where does cost ever get fit in, or it's like EPA doesn't care? They're just going to say, here it is, no matter what the cost is.
Yes, so that is correct. And that is where there is often a very understandable rub between the regulated industry that is going to have to bear the costs associated with the, downward adjustment in those standards as they're made, and the EPA. EPA always comes out and says, look, we understand that there are costs associated with making these adjustments. But at the end of the day, the Clean Air Act only speaks to a scientific review process that is strictly driven by the science and that is intended to protect public health and welfare. So if that's the case, and frankly, also the Supreme Court has, weighed in favor of EPA not considering costs. So it's not a discretionary point of issue here. Hence why, EPA takes the position that it does. However, the question of cost will absolutely and always does come up down in later stages after those standards have been revised. Now, I will add, does EPA have to change the standards? No. The Clean Air Act does not require a change to the standards after a 5-year review. You just have to look at the latest science and see whether or not an updated change to the standard is warranted. I'll give you a prime example. Back under the Obama administration, there was a 5-year review. I believe it was just for ozone. And at that point in time, the Obama administration opted not to make a change. When I was previously served under the Trump administration, we did a full-blown review of ozone and NAAQS. Ozone and PM, and based on the science at that point in time, opted to retain the standard. There has not been a situation where the standards have been set and then subsequently elevated to a less stringent level. They always continue to march down in stringency. They become more and more conservative over time. The question is there a scientific basis that warrants a further downward and more conservative adjustment, or is the current level and standard sufficiently protective of human health and the environment? So that's where you wind up. And I think that that's important for folks to remember, that although the Clean Air Act mandates a 5-year review cycle, it does not mandate a change to that standard.
But if you change the standard that you're looking at and saying, well, we need to make it more stringent, that becomes, unless the science has changed, that could be just a political response or a kind of the individual terms response to how certain things are looked at. Is that?
Yeah. And
Okay.
that is a serious consideration that has been brought forth under the recent reconsideration of the PM 2.5 NAAQS. What has happened there, and it's very unusual. So in 2020, we finalized the updated review of the PM and ozone NAAQS, which I had just referenced. So which means you weren't due for another 5-year cycle until 2025. Under a new administration, the EPA kind of did take a novel approach and said, actually, we're going to reconsider what has just been done. And we're going to, kind of crack that open again and take another look. So you have a couple of different organizations, and the one that's most notable and that you probably see mentioned most often in the news is the National Association of Manufacturers has sued EPA over this, and the fact that there is no reconsideration process under the Clean Air Act to kind of engage in this novel approach to the 5-year review process. And because it's a very different and very novel approach, that costs should have been reconsidered because a regular review had just been undertaken, as well as that it was taken out of procedural order, which is very unusual and also is, I think, very challenging for not just the regulated community, but also states that have to implement SIPs to keep up with those standards, and states or state implementation plans. So let me take a quick step back. When EPA promulgates a new NAAQS standard for any of the 6 criteria pollutants, it then kicks off a clock. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of that because folks will glaze over. But the clock basically sets forth a time frame in which states have to take that updated standard, take it back to their state agencies and say, okay, we have to come up with a game plan to meet these standards. So part of that process is after EPA promulgates the standards, they have a certain amount of time where they will look at all the air quality monitoring networks. And based on the data that's kicked back to them, they will go across the entire country and say, Alabama, here's a breakdown of all your attainment and non-attainment areas based on the latest standard of pick your criteria pollutant. And it'll tell Alabama, this is non-attainment, this is attainment, and in some cases, the degree of severity of which they are in non-attainment. Or if they're unclassifiable based on kind of what the data does or doesn't tell them. So that's when states get their attainment and non-attainment designations across, but within their state lines. The states then have to go back and say, we're going to promulgate rules and update we're gonna develop SIPs, state implementation plans that lay out a plan to get all of these areas that are in non-attainment into attainment. And that might involve the promulgation of rules to like give that some real teeth and make it go. That is a multi-year process. And it takes a lot longer than that. If you are in a non-attainment area to potentially come out of a non-attainment area and to be designated attainment. It takes a long time. There's a lot of science and data negotiations between EPA and your state regulatory agencies to make that happen. So when you suddenly tell, everybody, okay, PM and ozone NAAQS are not going to change effective, December 2020, that process has concluded. This is what you have going forward. Everyone says, all right, great. We know what the state of play is. When the Biden administration, EPA came in and said, actually, we're going to do a reconsideration and we're going to review that and we're going to, see if maybe we would come up with a different answer. That throws off timelines, plans, regulatory, clocks, the whole bit, and it's very challenging, which then trickles down to the regulated community. So sorry that might have been a little convoluted, but there's a lot that goes into it.
No, and that's fantastic. Picking up a couple of the points, so the non-attainment attainment came out of the NAAQS. Is that part of that? And so let's do a little more background on that. So that is it done just for states or areas or both? Is it you mentioned 6 pollutants? Can it be for any of them or all of them? How does that all work? And how does, if a certain area is looked for an attainment or non-attainment, how does that, is it for all 6 of them or one of them? Or talk a little more about that just so we have a better idea of how non-attainment works. And you got Dallas Fort Worth, I think, or San Antonio that has certain non-attainment. They're looking at Permian for certain, surely not the same, but maybe it is.
Sure. So no, that is a great question. So the way that attainment versus non-attainment works is when a standard is set for any of the criteria pollutants, and I will tell you this, when EPA does these 5-year reviews, they don't review all 6 of those pollutants at the same time. They're very, very intensive, resource heavy processes, so they're staggered. So it's every, like PM and ozone get done, then lead will get done. So they're staggered over kind of that 5-year cycle so that you don't have staff doing more than 1, max 2 pollutant review on an annual basis, because it is a tremendous amount of work. And it would just be overwhelming to do all 5 at the same time every 5 years. So I hope folks find that helpful as well. Now, that being said, and I'll use the most recent, PM and ozone updates as examples. So EPA makes their designations, and then they look across the country, or sorry, EPA sets its standards, then it looks across the country and says, okay, based on the National Ambient Air Quality Monitoring Network. So EPA has monitors usually co-located or co-sited with the state environmental regulatory agencies around the country. And that's what a lot of this information is driven by, is the data derived from that monitoring network. And it can be supplanted or complemented here and there by other monitors that meet EPA criteria. But for the most part, it is an EPA funded, cited network of air monitors around the country. So when you're looking at that, you run into a number of challenges, which is it's not uncommon in some areas. Like I'd say more densely populated areas are usually granted greater funding, which means you usually have more monitors in those areas, as opposed to rural areas where the population density isn't there. So, you'll have fewer monitors that's commensurate with whatever the population density is. So you do wind up with these gaps. Grant, I think to your point of in certain areas, you're going to see a lot of monitors and others you will see fewer. And that can provide its own sort of challenge because you have to extrapolate the data and kind of analyze it in a way which you think, should generate scientifically robust results. There are also all kinds of assumptions baked into the modeling.
Right.
So those are all things that really have to be taken into consideration when looking at the data that is generated and reviewed by EPA in making its attainment versus non-attainment designation. So at
And so
sometimes,
that will be done on one or more of the pollutants, and it'll be for an area around, usually around one of these
yes.
sensors, or so it wouldn't be the whole state typically.
No, 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 no.
Okay.
Now, so for example, in more densely populated areas, you're going to see more monitors, which means you can get much more granular data as
Right.
to the level of attainment or non-attainment that they may be in, because you can pinpoint the monitors and then industrial sources around them, which will really do a much better job informing like what the air quality situation is for any given criteria pollutant in that area. When you get further away, it just understandably becomes more difficult. So if you're in a more rural, less densely populated area and you only have, maybe a couple of monitors over a couple of 100-mile basis, and maybe you have one industrial, site that is, near them or in between them, that particular site is going to, carry a lot of the, data load for why the air quality in that area is good, bad, unclassifiable, whatever the case may be. So that can kind of create its own challenge. You couple that with, significant atmospheric conditions, which can vary widely across the country.
Yep.
For example, in like the Houston Galveston area, if for somebody that grew up in Texas and has talked to a lot of folks that have businesses there and that operate there, that Houston Galveston area has a very unique atmospheric set of conditions. Like it winds up being kind of a bowl of just circulating air. So if that's the case and you don't have, air that's kind of, being blown through, going from, west to east or north to south, you can wind up with the situation where you can take the data that's being generated, but then you've got to account for those atmospheric conditions that might be unique to that particular geographic location. If you look out west to a place like Utah, for example, a lot of the data and science around summer ozone, for example, is really focused on summer and in more urban areas. You go out to Utah, for example, their big ozone problem happens in the winter, and there's not concrete science as to why that happens. When they've got a lot of snowpack, when it's bright and sunny outside, as opposed to a cloudy day and it's really cold. So ozone in Houston in the summertime is very different from Utah in the wintertime, which is their ozone season. So you wind up with a situation where you're trying to account for very different geographies and atmospheric conditions as well. And I will say that, again, going back to 1970 when the Clean Air Act was, passed and signed into law, and then the rules promulgated, kind of establishing the NAAQS program. I don't know that everything was as well baked that when you say, hey, here are your standards across the country for these types of pollutants, that there was that level of scientific understanding at that point in time of how things would be best handled in order to drive down emissions and improve air quality. But we constantly learn more.
Yeah. I was going to bring this up later when we talked about the Permian Basin, because there's been a lot of talk about non-attainment being
Mhm.
prescribed there. My understanding is that there's basically one main monitor, and that's what was used to make El Paso non-attainment, but now it's being used for the Permian Basin. Is that true? Because I don't see how that win can go
Sure.
both ways. And that talk, and reason to go ahead and bring it up now, because you talk about rural and limited monitors, and it just seems like West Texas, Southeast New Mexico has limited monitors. So how can they prescribe that?
So first, I would definitely recommend, and I've not had a chance to check this out, but My understanding is that there might have been a different monitor that was actually being used, that it's not necessarily the El Paso monitor. Now,
Okay.
that being said, check with the TCEQ. They can give you the specifics on that. And two, there is a process by which the state and EPA can kind of go back and forth and perhaps share additional data that EPA didn't consider at the time that they were making the designations. So there is a little, I wouldn't call it a negotiation process necessarily, but if there's a difference of opinion on a designation that is given by EPA, where the state says, hey, we've got data, we had an emission event that y'all need to consider. Maybe it was wildfires out, in Southeast New Mexico, or maybe there was, something else that happened.
Sure.
Like one of those exceptional events. EPA, we think that you need to consider this before you render a formal designation status, especially if it's going to be a non-attainment one. So there are ways in which to engage EPA on that, and they're usually quite receptive to it, because they also want to make sure that their standards hold up and that the designations hold up in court, because it's never fun to, wind up having to litigate this, and EPA, wants to get it right from the jump. So in my experience, I found that for folks that are interested in engaging with them at that level, they're usually quite receptive to it, because they would like to get it right from the jump. They don't want it overturned in court, and that just takes forever to figure that
And
out.
I assume almost every designation is taken to a courthouse.
Not
It's
necessarily. It
oh,
it, it
okay.
really depends. I would say that some states are more comfortable litigating against EPA than others. And then there's also just kind of the calculation that goes into it from an economic standpoint. How big of a hit will an area have to take from economically speaking by going from being attainment to non-attainment? And I would say arguably, you've got some areas that are just much more rural. There's not a tremendous economic base, where maybe the cost of going to court or the likelihood of success is going to be challenging, and maybe that's just not worth it. But that's really done on a very local and state basis to say whether or not there's an appetite to take any of those issues to court. Some states happy to sue the EPA. Others a little bit more.
So that's a great point about the economic uh, pros and cons of all this. That again, I hear things about how if you're non-attainment, then it limits what type of equipment you can use. What effect does being designated non-attainment have on an economy, on a municipality, on an industry, and what type of things should we worry about?
So there is a significant cost associated in being designated non-attainment, and that cost continues if the area that's been designated as such remains as such. So if you are in an attainment area initially, and you want to uh, go build some type of manufacturing facility or some type of energy facility, you would go to your state agencies, depending upon what type had jurisdiction over that, but presumably a department or a commission of environmental quality, and say, I want to build X. I need to come to you for all of those permits. Tell me what I need to do. I'm going to run through that program. I'm going to comply with all of the state regs, which comply with all the federal regs. And I'm going to get all the permits I need so I can move forward with construction and operation. State says, let me see where you're proposing to be located. Great, you're in an attainment area. Just kind of much more straightforward. The regular state regs apply to you. You can, your emission limits are up to a very clearly defined threshold, because you are not otherwise going to be operating in a way that would be detrimental to public health or welfare.
Okay.
Great. So you're, moving forward with construction and presumably operation, keeping underneath whatever those emission limits are. But if you're in an attainment area, they are they are at least as stringent as the federal requirements. But if you're in a non-attainment area, because you're dealing with an area that is already has air quality issues that exceed a health-based standard, you will have to emit less in order to adjust for what is already poor air quality here, you will have to emit less than, say, your co-facility that is located a couple of counties over in an attainment area. It could be
Right.
the exact same footprint, exact same equipment, exact same operating protocols, but because you're in an area that has already been, designated as having poor air quality for one of those pollutants,
Right.
your emission potential is going to be commensurately less so that you are not worsening an already subpar situation. Hopefully you will be improving it and be helping the kind of overall portfolio of industry and economic growth move towards attainment. So you're going to have to install more stringent emission control equipment, depending upon what industry you're in. That could look very different. Your emission limits will likely be lower. And there might be some changes to your operating protocols. So you will have to operate and function differently in a non-attainment area, usually at greater cost to the company or to the facility than if you were in an attainment area.
And this has effects on municipalities as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, it is not uncommon that if a company is looking to, say, move to a state or to build a new facility, they are going to take a hard look at, okay, do we want to build in an attainment or a non-attainment area? And if it comes down to one of those issues of permitting is going to take longer, we're going to have to install more stringent equipment, we're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. You know what? If it's all the same, we're going to locate a couple hundred miles in a different area, and we're going to go to that attainment area, which draws away from tax bases, that significantly alters job creation. So yes, I mean, all of those things can definitely have a big impact. And it's not uncommon for larger urban areas to really struggle with that in the event that they've received a non-attainment designation. And then you also have, kind of the neighboring areas that perhaps don't have the same level of infrastructure,
Sure.
perhaps don't have the same workforce base, scrambling in some cases to accommodate those things, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for those areas. They can feel kind of a pinch initially, but you're taking something that otherwise would have made a lot of sense in one place, but because of the regulatory burdens, it gets shifted elsewhere. And that may not be in the company's best interest. And it is usually viewed as a loss from an economic development
Sure.
standpoint from municipalities. But it's a very competitive factor that really does play into where facilities are sited, or whether one facility versus another one winds up with an expansion. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Now, you said early on, you threw some words in that kind of gave me hope. It said, if it remains non-attainment, or I
Mhm.
think you said something. So that makes it sound like you can, if you get designated non-attainment, you can get out of that.
Yes.
But then earlier, something you said made me kind of think, well, once you're in it, it's a little bit like a tar baby and you can't get away. Are there examples where non-attainment have become attainment and they've been able to, and how has that worked? And how long did that take? How painful or not painful was that?
So it can happen. It does happen. It doesn't happen very often. The most recent example that I like to point to, West Virginia, actually in 2020, statewide was fully designated attainment. So it can happen. And as we know, West Virginia, coal country, a big background in that particular industry. So it can happen. It takes time. It takes a lot of effort.
Well,
Um,
if you just shut all the coal mines down, you can make it attainment.
Well,
Is that
it
what
comes at
happened?
a cost. It comes at a cost. So it is it
That
is
would be a
not
cost.
it is not an easy thing to accomplish. Can it be done? Yes. But
But like,
it is
how many examples are there? Is you mentioned that one, and you said you kind of said it can be, but then it's hard. Like, are there like three examples or three, or is, give me a perspective. Is it
sure.
80%, 5%?
I'd say probably closer to 5%, and I don't have an exact number. And one of the
No,
challenging things,
sure. I
because I
just wanted to
did,
get a
oh,
perspective.
sure,
It's so it's
yeah,
very rare that you get.
it ain't easy.
Okay.
It ain't easy. Now, sometimes there can be, like if you're in moderate non-attainment, If you were able to correct that issue sooner rather than later, you might have an easier time moving into attainment. But if you are in serious or severe non-attainment, I mean, candidly, it's going to be really tough to move back into attainment, especially because, again, the standards keep getting lower. So if you're already in non-attainment for, pick your pollutant and whatever standard you're dealing with, whichever, year they were issued, and if they keep getting more conservative, chances are you're not going to move into attainment. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's unlikely.
You also just mentioned something that we haven't described. It seems like there's different levels of non-attainment, moderate, or I know
Mhm.
you were using that as an adjective, but I thought there were also
Mhm.
different categories. Explain
Yes.
that to us also of how, I assume that just means you have better or worse numbers, so you get moved into
Yes.
certain areas. Is that
That
all
is
it is?
yes. And you can move within that designation scale.
So I would assume it's better to be in the lower end of the non-attainment,
Mhm.
but it's still bad, or is
It's
it
still
more?
non-attainment.
So it's more just you don't want to get into it at all, and then the scales to the different levels. Okay, fair enough
Mhm.
on that. So so on the success stories, the one or two that's out there, I'm my words, not yours. What did people have to do to make that happen to get out of non-attainment?
It's a lot of regulatory oversight, making sure that the state rules that are promulgated have teeth to them, and that industry adheres to it. And a lot of that goes into when do you have planned shutdowns or mothballs, the plans to mothball facilities. Like how does that work into your plan? Because one thing that state implementation plans are intended to do is when EPA sets these NAAQS standards, presumably, the states are then in charge of figuring out whatever way works best for them and works best with the regulated industry from a timeline standpoint for their facilities to operate, to figure out like, hey, how, really, how do we get from non-attainment to attainment? What does that look like? Um, so then there's a lot of engagement between state regulators and state industry to say, okay, this is what we're planning for, this is what we can do, run the numbers. Does that move us from non-attainment back into attainment? How long is it going to take to do that? What other factors could impact that favorably or unfavorably? I mean, all of that comes into play. And then, like I said earlier, you have your atmospheric conditions, which are outside of any regulator's control. So how does that figure into it? So that's what goes into it, and that's timely and costly.
And that time period you talked about, I would assume that's a pretty it's not going to just happen the next year. You're talking
It
decades or at least
no
years.
A few years. So
A few years. Okay.
EPA sets a standard. EPA then goes and designates as non-attainment or attainment across the country. Then states have a couple of years to develop their state implementation plans. Then EPA gets to review them. And then once approved, or if approved, the state then has to turn around and within a certain time frame make it happen. So that is how that's supposed to go. So you're looking at a multi-year process. Like, realistically speaking, it's supposed to take, I want to say, 3 or so years, if I remember correctly, to get a SIP from kind of soup to nuts, from standard setting to a SIP out the
Right.
door, 3 to 4 years. Um, I mean, practically speaking, it takes longer. EPA does not approve or disapprove or conditionally approve some of those SIPs for much longer than that, just because it takes so much time from a science and a data standpoint to hammer them out and get them to a point where they can be submitted to EPA for review, and then they either get a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Okay.
And and if they get a thumbs down, back to the drawing board, and you have to, kind of keep going at
Keep
it.
going through it. So the next series of questions, I'd like to kind of home in on the Permian Basin because we keep hearing that it has a chance for non-attainment designation, but it, I, I think of it as a rural area. Obviously, it's got oil wells and all, so it's kind of a different rural area. But would you look at that designation differently, being in a rural area like that? And as far as you've already mentioned that you probably don't have as many monitors, there's weather patterns, but how kind of with a little bit of an eye on West Texas, New Mexico, West
Mhm.
New Mexico, how would you look at that from an EPA perspective?
I think if I were at EPA, that there would be a great focus on kind of what the population density looks like, so that when it comes to taking the data from monitors that are out in the area to help inform a designation status. Um, I think that would be a big focus. You're not dealing with a population density like Chicago, San Antonio. I mean, even Des Moines, Iowa.
Nothing
Like
close.
it's
Nothing
just
close.
different. And
And I guess it also depends how broad of an area. And
yes.
then the broader the area, then if you only have certain monitors, that makes it
Mhm.
seems like more challenging.
Yes, but you have to remember that at the end of the day, the agency gets a lot of deference on uh, fact-based scientific determinations, and they will argue and err in favor of being more and not less protective of human health and the environment. Within that margin of safety, they don't have to be most protective of it. They don't have to prevent all air pollution, but within that within the appropriate band of that kind of standard setting. That's the argument I would make back, that if there was a colorable argument that you could appropriately and scientifically designate West Texas as attainment because of the lower population density, um, uh, fewer number of air monitors that are generating robust data that can be readily relied upon, or where those kind of extrapolated data sets can really prove out a real public health or welfare concern. I think that would probably be the most likely argument that you could rely upon. But again, EPA is going to err on the side of being more, not less conservative when it comes to setting standards on behalf of human health.
Because several of the things you've described between the size, the weather, maybe fewer monitors for rural, you plug all that into some type of a formula or
Mhm.
empirical analysis, but which sounds scientific, but if you're having to that those variabilities seems like there's a lot of art form in how you
Mhm.
create the outcome. And I don't
Yeah.
mean that like conspiracy oriented, but it just
Oh,
as an engineer, I look at that data that you're describing. And it's like how does the EPA use those very
sure.
random data sets
Mhm.
to to create that?
So there are models on the books that are out there that are used. They've been made publicly available, and they are the basis upon which you can pull data from those monitors, and then you plug them into a formula, basically, or a model. And whatever that model generates is supposed to be what everyone's agreed to kind of use from a modeling standpoint and from a data. Authentication and a reproducibility standpoint. Now, it's interesting you bring this up. So, one of the things that has recently popped up is a question of how well funded and maintained the National Ambient Air Quality Monitoring Network has been kind of taken care of over the years, and then utilizing different types of air monitors, either in conjunction with or in replacement of some of those. Obviously, we've got new technology that's come on board, and sometimes you have to replace them, or you're adding to the monitoring network. Um, the technology just that's inherent in those monitoring devices, which are highly sophisticated. I mean, these things cost tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, they're not just a little weather station you can buy on Amazon and pop out on a fence post. Um, uh, Congress has even been looking at how accurate those have been and how they've affected modeling, and whether or not there's a question of accuracy in what they are providing from a data and a monitoring standpoint and modeling standpoint, which is then used to inform, where you're setting the
Sure.
NAAQS standards, and how you're rendering your attainment versus non-attainment decisions. So it's imperfect. You are absolutely right. And there is a certain level of art associated to it. Modeling is built on assumptions. Well, those assumptions are pretty darn important because depending upon what those basic assumptions are that are built into it, that is going to drive a certain result coming out of the model potentially. So there's a lot to go into that. States, have very differing opinions in some cases as to how EPA does that and what those models look like and the assumptions that are built into those models. So it is an ongoing source of kind of scientific back and forth to try to get to a place where folks have a high degree of confidence in the data that underpins how EPA sets new NAAQS standards and then how they're making those attainment versus non-attainment designations.
Kind of a follow up on that, and this is probably way too much in the weeds, so you probably don't know the specifics, but like given what you just said, like what is the average age of these monitor systems out there? Are they like, because if they're 10 years old, technology has changed significantly, and I'm guessing some of them are been out there a lot longer than 10 years.
Yes. So thank you for not asking me for a
Yeah.
particular age or
No.
average. Yes. So there's a range. Some of them have been out there for quite a while. Some of them are, much newer and have been brought on more recently. I think what this gets to is that at the end of the day, because they are so important to the regulatory decision-making process, there is an interest to make sure that that network is sufficiently funded to keep up with repair, to keep up with O&M, to keep up with upgrades where upgrades need to occur because they've lived at or beyond their useful life. Whatever the case may be, maybe they've suffered damage from adverse weather events, whatever the case may be. That network is more appropriately and sustainably funded because so much rides on them. So that's a big outstanding issue. And I would argue, um, and this is a double-edged sword. If you want more granularity and specificity as to what air quality looks like across the United States, and again, this is a double-edged sword, you probably want more monitors disseminated equally across the country, not less, so that you really do get a better picture of where your problem areas are and frankly, where your problem areas are not, so that you're addressing state and federal funds to fix air quality issues where they are and in a meaningful, very well-informed way.
All right, so now I'm going to give you a chance to have some hot sports opinions here that will either help your career or not. So be careful how you
Okay.
answer this. But if you're in West Texas and you only have one or two monitors, is the community and the industry better off saying, yes, EPA, put more monitors out here? Or are they better? Because my understanding is that the state is pushing and saying, no, we don't want monitors there.
Mhm.
Or does that hurt them and they use this one or two monitors and extrapolate?
It can go either way. I was told
There you go.
very wisely. I was told very wisely by a former deputy regional administrator, is if you're going to test, you better know what the results are before you do the testing, because once they're there, that's it. You have to live with them. So I think that's a question that industry, if it's oil and gas, if it's manufacturing, doesn't matter. Pick your industry. You start testing and you better be willing to deal with the results that you get. And to that end, what I would recommend to anybody that is kind of operating in today's regulatory environment or wants to, there will likely be more testing down the road, be it required at the state level or at the federal level. I mean, you've already got flyovers happening all over the Permian
Sure.
Basin and using satellite imagery. So it may not be off of, static stationary air quality monitors that are, funded and cited by EPA, but folks are picking up all sorts of stuff from drones and planes. So it's happening. It's just not happening in the way that folks have traditionally expected that information to be generated. So if it's happening, Be sure to get your operational house in order. If you got leaks, if you got problems, like we are past a point now, because the technology has quickly surpassed whatever the state or federal government's going to be able to do with their monitoring networks. I mean, you've got massive companies funding satellite imagery across the world to see where
Sure.
you've got emission hotspots. If that's the case, I mean, it's already happening. And I would encourage folks to wake up to it and just realize that, regulatory entities and ENGOs and anybody that's got a dog in that hunt, they're going to be leveraging that to their benefit. So be savvy to that.
But if you're trying to, you said you need to have the kind of know the answer before you put the monitors out. But if they keep changing the standards, which it seems like they keep lowering them,
Mhm.
then you're kind of chasing the unknown. So that
Mhm.
makes it even more difficult. So
Yes.
maybe that's my little editorializing coming in here. So
Enough.
uh,
And a good point at that.
good. Well, Anne, thank you very much. As you all saw, Anne is very, very smart in all this, and it's going to become a very huge issue. Well, not become, it is a huge issue. And so, Anne, if someone says she knows what she's talking about, we need her help, how do they reach you?
Oh, well, Grant, that's very kind of you. Please go to www.austin, as in the capital of Texas, hyphen legal.com. You can find me there, or you can find me on LinkedIn. So please feel free to reach out. Would love to talk to you and perhaps work with others in the future.
And under LinkedIn, Anne Idsal Austin.
Yes. Hmm.
Okay,
And I
fantastic.
I run Austin Legal and Public Affairs. So that is
Oh,
how you
LinkedIn
find me.
under that name. Okay, fantastic. Good. Thanks for clarifying that. Thank you, Ann. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Grant. It's been a pleasure.